Welcome, welcome everybody. Happy 683rd of March 2020, and welcome to what we're really excited to be the first of the IB departmental seminars jointly held with the Campbell Centre for the Study of Animal Welfare. I'm going to get out of the way in a second, but before I do, I'm going to stop because otherwise I will trip and fall, and that makes for exciting Zoom, but not efficient communication. And I'm going to stop to just, we're going to acknowledge where we are, where we're sitting, and where we've come from. I grew up on the unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. I did my PhD on the Ganigawage unceded nation territory. And I moved here to Guelph, where if you're sitting with me, you're sitting on the land of the Between the Lakes Treaty No. 3 in the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And so that land, as you know, is part of the Dish with One Spoon, which is a covenant between Indigenous nations to live peaceably on the territories of the Great Lakes. And today, of course, that's home to many First Nations, Inuit and Métis. And so it's important to take a moment to acknowledge and recognize that all of our research occurs on Indigenous land, and that we must work to ensure that our activities, our teachings, and our learnings honor and respect Indigenous peoples and lands. It's important that we listen. Acknowledging that reminds us of our collective responsibility to the people and the places where we live and where we learn. And I'm going to stop my share and pass this to Georgia. There.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. And so it's my huge pleasure to introduce Dr. Popp today. Dr. Popp is Anishinaabe and a member of the Week-Wemikung unceded territory on Manitoulin Island. As a scholar in the School of Environmental Sciences, her research and her teaching both weave together Indigenous and Western ways of knowing in order to advance environmental and ecological science. But that's far from all, and I'm just going to quote her on Twitter yesterday. "If you ever thought you weren't enough to make a difference, think again. I come from nothing, grew up in poverty, a high school dropout, and an Indigenous woman with a passion to be in a field dominated by men and Western worldviews. Today," that was yesterday, "I am a Canada Research Chair." So I really hope that gives you goosebumps like it does me. And it captures something, it captures one of the reasons I wanted to hear Jessie. So Jessie's the first of 3 or 4 Indigenous speakers that the Campbell Centre for the Study of Animal Welfare is hosting this semester. And this is because hundreds, maybe thousands of years before Charles Darwin, Indigenous people recognized that other animal species are related to us humans. And hundreds, perhaps thousands of years before Ruth Harrison and Peter Singer, Indigenous people recognized this affects how we should treat them. And so to me, this highlights the type of wisdom that we risk losing when we subject people to cultural or even real genocide. And so I'm honored and really thrilled that Jessie can share some of it today. Thank you so much, Jessie. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that lovely introduction. And it's such a pleasure to be here today. I will start sharing my screen here. How does that work? Can everyone see the? All right. Well, it's a real pleasure to be here. And I want to start by saying, Ani, Jessie, Indigenous, Wikwimkong Donjaba, Makwadodam, Anishinaabe, and Dao Miigwech. Hi, everyone. My name is Jessie Popp. I'm a member of Wikwimkong unceded territory and a fairly new faculty member here at the University of Guelph. I'm joining you today from the Robinson-Huron Treaty area, and really delighted to share some Indigenous perspectives on animals in the context of resource or relation. Sorry about that. So Georgia, you did mention that I'm fairly new to the University of Guelph, which is true. I joined about 1.5 years ago, right in the middle of the pandemic. So I haven't had a chance to meet very many of you yet. Some of you probably didn't even know I was here. So I wanted to start by sharing a little bit about myself first. So I mentioned that I'm a member of Wikwimkong unceded territory. I am Anishinaabe on my mother's side and mixed European descent on my father's side. I didn't grow up in the community. The community is located on Manitoulin Island in Ontario. I actually grew up in Northern Ontario, Sudbury area. I am a wildlife ecologist. I did all my degrees in biology, and for the most part, I have studied large terrestrial mammal ecology, looking at population dynamics and so on. I've worked with species like caribou and elk and moose, bear and wolves, but more and more my work is taking a more holistic approach because all things are interconnected. I work with Indigenous communities across Canada, but mostly communities within the Anishinaabe Nation. And we work together on projects that Indigenous communities identify as important environmental projects. And we bring together Indigenous and Western ways of knowing to help advance environmental ecological science in the spirit of reconciliation. So when I talk about Indigenous perspectives, weaving Indigenous and Western ways of knowing, and even the title of my presentation, Indigenous Perspectives, I want to first make very clear that Indigenous peoples are very diverse. Diverse as the lands as we are part of, with many distinct nations, cultures, ways of knowing and being. There's a wide variety. We're thinking in terms of Canada, Indigenous, representing Inuit, Métis, and First Nations, which of course within each of those, there are many nations and communities as well. That said, Leroy Little Bear, who was the founding director of Harvard University's Native American program, said that given Canada's cultural and linguistic diversity, it's foolish to suggest that a single Native perspective exists. Yet, there are unique ways of understanding events that have demonstrated to me and others there are culturally specific ways of appreciating what we may have previously considered to be universally accepted ideas. So there are differences among nations. However, there are culturally specific ways, for example, in Indigenous philosophies that are very similar among many nations. So I personally, being from the Anishinaabe Nation and learning from elders and knowledge holders, mostly among the Anishinaabe Nation, this is the perspective that I bring, although I do share a few other perspectives that I have learned along the way. So just to make note of that. So, and what do I mean about weaving or bringing together knowledge systems? Well, first I wanted to chat a little about worldview. Raymond Periotti says that an individual's worldview, or the way this individual sees the world, has a major impact on the way that he or she interprets it. So again, we can have differences in worldview among cultures, nations, communities, families, and even individuals. We all have different worldviews that are all equally valid and important. And those worldviews, the way we see the world, can affect the way we understand the world, the way we interpret the world, and how we relate to the world. So there are many concepts that Indigenous nations have used to describe embracing multiple ways of knowing and trying to understand the world. And one of those is two-eyed seeing. This is a concept coined by Mi'kmaq elder Albert Marshall from Unama'ki, or Cape Breton in Nova Scotia. And basically he says that you can better understand the world, the environment, or in general, which will benefit all of humanity by seeing through two eyes or two lenses. One through the strengths of Indigenous ways of knowing or perspectives, and another through the strengths of Western ways of knowing and perspectives, because each perspective might see things differently, can seem very complementary to one another, and can help make a better, more holistic understanding of the picture as a whole. Now, of course, this can be applied to, for example, different perspectives among Indigenous nations, for example, and not just Western and Indigenous, but differences in Indigenous nations if there's different perspectives as well. So understanding and seeing the world from different perspectives can be, again, very complementary and can help see things better as a whole. So now in thinking about, how to share, discussions on worldview, the first thing that comes to my mind is creation stories or teachings. And there are many creation stories that exist, all very, very important. And I wanted to share two with you that I'm familiar with. One being one that most of you are probably very familiar with, the teachings or the creation story shared in the Bible. So this is actually a scan from the book of Genesis, which is the very first book in the Bible. And it talks about, in this book, it talks about the creation of the earth. and how God created the earth and said, let there be light, and all the constituents in the earth. And here in verse 26, it says, and God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness. Let them have dominion over the earth, over the sea, over the fowl of the air, over the cattle, over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. And then in verse 28 says, and God blessed them and said unto them, be fruitful. So talking here to first humans, be fruitful and multiply, replenish the earth, subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. So with this very, very important book to Western society, some people may interpret this as instructions for how to live with the environment, how to relate to the environment. And with words like subdue and dominate, or referring animals as livestock, imagine how this might translate, if you felt like these were instructions, imagine how this might translate into your relationship with the earth around you. Another creation story that I'm familiar with is the Anishinaabe creation story. And it goes like this. And Robin Wall Kimmerer shared this in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, as well. So a very long time ago, there existed a place called Sky World, where lived a great nation of sky beings known as sky dwellers. In the beginning, Sky Woman, who was pregnant, was peering through a hole to the earth, which was then covered in water. And she peered too closely that she fell, and she started falling and falling. And as she was falling, the geese flying by saw her, and they knew they had to help her. So they tried to catch her, and they caught her, but they realized she was just so heavy and they couldn't hold her for long. So the geese quickly called to council of all the beings to talk about what to do. So came forward the loon, the otters, beavers, fish, and more. A great turtle came to the surface and offered Sky Woman a resting place. The others understood that Sky Woman needed land, and they knew that there was mud at the bottom of the sea, so they started diving to the bottom of the sea floor. But the sea floor was so deep. At first, loon tried, but couldn't reach. Then otter, beaver, sturgeon, no one could reach the bottom. Finally, it was Muskrat's turn. He was the weakest swimmer of all, but he really wanted to try, so he dove down. He dove down, and he was gone for so long. His relations started to worry. Next thing, up came Bubbles, and to the surface, Muskrat's limp body floated to the top. And in his paw that he held tightly was mud that they had all tried so desperately to gather. He had given his life for Sky Woman. Turtle told the animals to put the mud on his back, and Sky Woman worked to spread it. She was moved by gratitude, and she danced on the turtle's back, caressing the earth with love. She held her own gift in her hand as well. When she fell, she held seeds from Sky World, and she planted them. And together with our relations, the earth was formed, which we now call Turtle Island, also known as North America. So the important part in this story was the animals chose to give their life for her. And they were her life raft then, and now we need to be their life raft today when they need our help. So now imagine how this creation story might translate into worldview or relationship with the environment. So again, emphasizing that everyone's worldview, way of knowing, creation stories, all equally important and all play an important role. And when I think a little bit more on creation story and worldview, this is a meme that I found online. I often see it with an eco versus ego title. And often when I think of what I have learned in Western academic institutions, sort of, viewing life as in sort of a hierarchical way, with humans on top, and then the next sort of order of importance are mammals and birds, all the way down to invertebrates and plants, which of course not to everyone, but this is often how I thought I was taught, is this hierarchy. And that, Western society in academic institutions, we tend to use a reductionist approach. So sort of breaking things down into smaller parts. And we have, for example, wildlife ecologists like myself, entomologists, we have, herpetologists, and that's really important. It's important to organize things like that, because then we become specialists in our own, in specific fields, and we learn a lot about specific things. But it actually isn't very often that we all get together and we talk about how our work relates and interacts to one another. When I think about Indigenous worldviews, on the other hand, I often think about interconnection. So for example, this circular representation of life, in that humans are not at the top of the chain, that everything is in balance and interconnected, and that many Indigenous worldviews view connections in a holistic way as opposed to reductionist. And this is also important, understanding things from a view of how things are all connected, maybe understanding a little bit less about, having the expertise in one field a little bit less. But now, could you imagine both of these ways of understanding the world coming together, and how complementary that could be together? So I often also think about the medicine wheel, which is an important teaching tool to many nations, including the Anishinaabe Nation. It's a teaching tool that can represent really anything. It teaches us about balance, about interconnection. We learn that we are all part of this medicine wheel. We are all part of the circle of life. We're all interconnected. We all balance one another. And if we do something in that circle to another being, for example, we will do something to us because we are part of that circle. Herman Michels, who's a Cree scholar, said Indigenous people around the globe share a worldview of interdependence, connectedness, and relatedness. So again, emphasizing that there is a huge diversity among Indigenous peoples. However, there are these perspectives that are often shared, and for example here, interdependence, connectedness, and relatedness. So I wanted to bring in some of my own research and share a little bit with you about how I have understood these interconnections, and how individuals, elders, and old followers who have shared these insights with me and our research team. Recently, we participated in a project connecting guardians in a changing world. Guardians just meaning Indigenous environmental stewards, and changing world referring to the environment, and how the environment is drastically changing in so many different aspects. Because communities in the Anishinaabe Nation wanted to come together to chat about important environmental research direction, to get people all together, sharing ideas and moving ahead together. So this was a big workshop we put on that Magnenawan First Nation led in partnership with myself, Dr. Deb McGregor from York University, who's a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Environmental Justice, and Dr. Adam Ford from University of British Columbia. So we implemented this workshop where we invited communities, Anishinaabe Nation communities in the Robinson Huron Treaty area, and we invited an elder, a youth, and a lands representative from each community to help facilitate intergenerational knowledge transfer. And of course, because youth are our next generation. So over 2 days, we had about 40 people join the workshop from 12 First Nation communities in the area. And we wanted to focus on environmental issues of most concern. And so we broke up into sharing circles where we had a facilitator in smaller groups. Now, because talking about environmental issues can be a huge discussion and can go in many different directions, because there are so many environmental issues facing us today, we thought we need to find a way to narrow the scope of this and get, see if there's an interest in people to go in just one sort of direction and focus on that for now. We came across this concept, cultural keystone species, which Gibraldi and Turner define as species that shape in a major way the cultural identity of a people, as reflected in the fundamental roles these species have in diet, materials, medicines, or spiritual practices. So the idea being that certain species are very, very important to Indigenous cultures, and they play roles that are much more than just subsistence. So this is a definition that we shared with participants in the workshop. And then we had specific discussion points. For example, how would you describe a cultural keystone species? Which regional plant or animal species do you consider as a cultural keystone species to the community? So we led with these discussion points. And although people did describe a few species, to our surprise, there was a lot of hesitation to do so, and even some opposition to this idea of cultural keystone. One individual, for example, said, well, I would say all life. Someone else said the teaching you get from our elders is that there's no one species that's more important than the other. Someone else said almost every one of the species is a keystone in itself. They're all very important. And another person said, yeah, that's the difference between Western science and our traditional teachings. We believe everything's interconnected. So in order of importance, they're all very important. Some individuals went on to say all species need balance. So bringing in those teachings of the medicine wheel, we need balance. All species regulate each other. They regulate us. So that's why they're all important, even the smallest little bacteria. They are our teachers, they are our providers. They give us life and they sustain us. And then finally, one participant said, as far as I'm concerned, all animal and plant life is a keystone species. Everything that's there, all the plant life, all the species, animals, fish that swim, animals that crawl, four-legged, the birds, they're all connected. They all have a role in the environment. So they help each other in doing what they're supposed to do. Even the insects, they have a role in it all because everything's connected to everything else. So you might want to make a special note that all species are keystone species. So really interesting too here that, you know, in addition to talking about connection and balance, and, you know, a lot of people even mentioned those small species, bacteria, even insects. And then additionally, to elaborate on this a little bit more, I want to emphasize the importance of language and how language can, just language in itself can hold knowledge and can hold science. Brad Howie, who was a MES student in my lab last term, co-supervised by Dr. Andrew Young, had a really great project where he was working to bring Indigenous perspectives into the University of Guelph's Arboretum outreach materials. And he made this amazing report. And in it, I'm just pulling an excerpt here. He said, the word for insect is Manidosh, which can be translated to little spirit. This displays the power of the Anishinaabe language and how connection to nature and environmental stewardship is built within the words of the language. Insects are seen not as creatures who create largely negative experiences, but they are seen as beings with spirits, albeit tiny spirits. So all our relations are important, all connected, and we are part of that circle. Now, I mentioned some people did mention specific species, and here's an example. Someone said the moose, the caribou, they're like cousins or sisters. And this was, a lot of people were talking about this, being cousins or sisters, not just to each other, but also to us, because we, again, are all related. So this brings me to this concept or phrase that you may have heard, all my relations. And a lot of different Indigenous nations, communities, and individuals use this phrase, all my relations. In the Anishinaabe Nation, I've heard people, Mi'kmaq communities use this term, Cree, for example. And there are many different phrases in language, in Indigenous languages, that also elaborate on this concept of all my relations. So Herman Mischel, again, Cree scholar, says, Indigenous philosophies are based on a foundation of respect for all ways of knowing. Although we have diverse knowledge systems, we're all related and we honor each other's ways. The respect we have for all our relations is based on a philosophy of coexistence and the inherent responsibilities and obligations involved in maintaining relationships. Worldviews are connected to relationships. And when Herman Mischel talks about all my relations, he is referring to amongst each other as humanity, but also amongst our non-human relatives. So we are all related. So here's an example of a few different nations and language used to describe all my relations. So in Anishinaabe, Anishinaabe people using Anishinaabemowin, the Anishinaabe language is Nikanagana, which Sue Chiblo shared with me, meaning all my relations, but there are different ways of saying or referring to all my relations. And understanding, you know, the environment in a kincentricity sort of way, so that, you know, saying relations, but also understanding these plants, these animals are our kin. Now, this idea of relations is not something that is unfamiliar to Western society. I'm sure most of you have seen this. It's a phylogenetic tree, and we're all related to a common ancestor. And of course, humans are part of that connection. And here's a funny human right here. So broadly speaking, we do, all of us really recognize that humans are part of those relations, that we are all connected. Yet for me, that never translated well through my academic career within the subdisciplines of Western institutions. And as we know, academic institutions have been based after European settlement in very Eurocentric ways of thinking. So when I was a student, I didn't really learn that humans were connected to nature. It was always something I was taught, you know, as being separate in my own experience. The late Western Shoshone spiritual leader, Corbin Harney, famously said, Native people are not separate from the environment. We are the environment. And of course, I think that applies to all humans. We are all part of the environment. But again, not something that we maybe are encouraged to really relate to in academic settings. Going back to my own experience and maybe the experience that some of you had, I remember when I was in biology in my undergrad degree, in one of my first or second year classes, I remember we just started learning about, doing research, study sample sizes, animals as research subjects. And then we learned one day that you're not supposed to name animals. You can't name them. You have to assign them numbers because they are study subjects. And we learned that, Jane Goodall was one of those people who broke that, unspoken rule, and she named the chimpanzee she worked with because she related to them. And I just remember thinking, like, the reason I got into biology was because I relate so well to the wildlife and animals and all their relations, and I want to be there to protect, and I feel this relationship, but to call them numbers, it was just, for me, just so backwards. And again, feeling that humans were being separate from nature. When I took my biology classes, when I took ecology and mammalogy, like, humans weren't in those courses. We learned about, humans and interactions through specific courses like human environment interactions, for example, or wildlife management. Now, Dr. Henry Lickers, who's a Haudenosaunee member of the Seneca Nation and commissioner of the International Joint Commission, has said that First Nations people view themselves not as custodians, stewards, or having dominion over the earth, but as an integrated part in the family of earth. The earth is my mother, the animals, plants, and minerals are my brothers and sisters. So again, mentioning that kinship relationship with all beings. But also here, he mentions the earth is my mother. So many of you may have heard of that, Indigenous nations, for example, referring to Mother Earth. Now, when you think about a mother, I know, at least for me, when I was a kid growing up, and most mothers provide everything their child needs, just as the earth provides everything that we need. Every single thing we need, the earth provides for us. And when I think of my own mother, and here's my mom right here, I respect her deeply. I love her deeply, and I care for her, and she has always cared for me. And when I think about respecting my mother, I think about, say my mother was cooking, Christmas dinner, working hard to make a meal for me and my siblings, and I was working on something and had some garbage. Would I throw it at her while she's cooking? No, I would never disrespect her like that. Maybe when she's aged and she really needs my help running a bath or getting her a drink of water, would I pour toxic chemicals in there and put her in the water or give that to her to drink? Of course I wouldn't. I care for her, I respect her, and I want to take care of her. So just imagine if people did feel like that with the earth as a mother, would people give more respect to the earth? So relationships are so important. Viewing things in terms of how you view the world and how you relate to the world is very, very important. And other Indigenous philosophies that are very similar among many nations are values like respect, reciprocity, and responsibility. So it's important to respect our mothers, our relations, the earth. It's important to be reciprocal, so giving back. And it is our responsibility to care for the earth and all our relations as the earth and our relations care for us. So to illustrate the importance of respect, reciprocity, and responsibility, I want to share with you the Honorable Harvest, which is a set of unwritten guidelines, both ethical and practical, that govern human consumption. It's the canon of the Honorable Harvest guards against overexploitation, protecting the future of plants and animals as well as humans. So Robin Wall Kimmerer describes the Honorable Harvest in her book, Breeding Sweetgrass, and this is an incredible book. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. So she says that when thinking about harvesting, you should know the ways of the ones who take care of you, so that you may take care of them. Introduce yourself, be accountable as the one who comes asking, and ask permission before taking. Abide by the answer, never take the first and never take the last, and you won't if you never take the first. Take only what you need. Take only which is given. Never take more than half, and always leave some for the others. Harvest in a way that minimizes harm and use it respectfully. Never waste what you've taken. Share. Give thanks for what you have been given. Give a gift in reciprocity for what you have taken. Sustain the ones who sustain you, and the earth will last forever. And now I wanted to kind of elaborate a little bit on the honorable harvest and relate to some of those values in an example from some of the research that we're doing in my lab in pertaining to moose. So as many of you might know, moose are declining across much of North America for reasons that we're not exactly sure why. Now, Western science is working very hard to understand what's happening with moose. And of course, this moose decline is very concerning to many, many people, including Indigenous people who rely heavily on moose for more than subsistence. So prior to this project, as far as I'm aware, research hadn't taken an approach to braid together Western knowledge and understanding of moose decline with Indigenous understanding knowledge of moose decline. As Indigenous people and hunters, for example, who are on the land and who have, probably firsthand seen a lot of changes in the environment, have probably a lot of very important things to say and share. So we worked with, this is a project led by Bigtagong Anishinaabe, which is an Anishinaabe Nation community in Northwestern Ontario, and later other communities joined, Magnetawan First Nation and Shawanigan First Nation, where we wanted to chat with community members, elders, knowledge holders, hunters about why moose are declining, what people are seeing on the land, and how moose are important to nations. So to start this project off, I did one of the coolest things I've ever done in my life. I attended a moose hunt camp, and this is where we were chatting with community members and asking some of these questions. And the moose hunt camp is actually, it's a 1-week event where the community completely shuts down. Instead of going to work in community, people go to moose hunt camp. They camp or they come for the day. Instead of going to school, kids get on the bus and they come to moose hunt camp for the day and go home at the end, because this is a learning opportunity. Not only is it about hunting, and it's about hunting for harvesting for those who can't hunt for themselves, so sharing, but it is also about learning and about building relationships and social bonds. So for example, we learned about, harvesting, processing, and about different properties of traditional medicines, how to harvest and process wild rice, make birch bark baskets, make fish nets, cook goose over a fire, and how to respect the moose and use every part of that moose. We learned how to cook moose nose and heart. We learned that, different bones were used for different tools. We learned so many different things, and it was just, really illustrated to me respect that this community had for moose, and then talking about, what factors were related to moose and hearing concern in people's voices that very concerned, and responsibility to care for that moose as that moose cares for us was paramount. So a lot of people share the significance of moose, and I'll share with you just one quote here where Juanita Starr says, a lot of people don't realize, most people just see moose as food, but it's not just food. It's more than food. It's creating a circle of being. You're getting the teaching aspects, you're getting the social aspects, the value of moose far greater than any one person thinks. And after chatting with several communities, we created this image here by Steve Trudeau from Wikwemukong, unceded territory, just displaying sort of the different ways that moose are important through food, social relationships, knowledge sharing, teaching youth, material use, traditions, identity, and of course the environment. So moose are important in so many ways. They are an important relative like all our other relatives or all our other relations, and we have a responsibility to care for the moose. Now, Indigenous worldviews, ways of knowing, people were here for thousands of years before Christopher Columbus arrived in 1492. And as Europeans started settling Turtle Island, some people viewed Indigenous people's ways of knowing as inferior to Eurocentric or Western worldviews. Some people even, suggesting that Indigenous people were savages, so that Eurocentric ways of understanding the world were far superior, and that Indigenous people weren't civilized. Now, when Europeans arrived, the environment in Europe at that time had some pressure as people were using the land. And so when people started arriving to Turtle Island, saw a very lush environment. Some people thought they found the Garden of Eden, which is a lush environment that's described in the Bible. So for example, Henry Kelsey, who's a European explorer, out here depicted looking at the fields of the plains, at the vast herds of buffalo. It's estimated that we actually had about 60 million buffalo across the plains historically when Europeans first arrived. And buffalo were very, very important to people of the plains who used buffalo for for virtually everything, a very important animal to the people of the plains. So Stephen Kretsch in Ecological Indian was talking about, this environment, and he says that other Europeans were awestruck by North America's natural world. They labored to describe what they encountered. Never had they seen birds or other animals in such profusion. Fish and shellfish so large, forests so expansive, trees towered above them, producing quantities of nuts, berries, extensive beds of shellfish, blanketed estuaries and shorelines. Fish schooled, spawned, or beached themselves in countless numbers, and birds darkened the sky and eclipsed the sun. Life teemed. And people wanted to take advantage of this as a way, if you're an individual and you see this life as a resource that you can take advantage of and get profit from, people actually started flooding to Turtle Island to take advantage, and then started the fur trade, which many of you have probably heard of, and with that, over harvest. The animals were harvested just for their furs, for example, to use for fashion, to make profit and to build a life here in the New World. But animals weren't just harvested for that, of course. Over harvest even occurred as a form of assimilation. So as I mentioned, early settlers wanted to assimilate Indigenous people because they, felt that they were inferior or uncivilized. So making them more like, the more superior, which of course is not true, but more what they thought was more superior Western society. So for an example here with buffalo were killed just for their hides. And it's been said that this has been a form of just cultural assimilation, having a people who depend so heavily on buffalo. If your way of being disappears, you have no choice but to change, how you are, how you relate, and how with the environment. So piles and piles of buffalo hides, and of course this left behind many bones and skulls that actually Indigenous people would pick up to trade for cans of meat, which were then brought to fertilizing plants, which here you can see a picture depicting a pile of buffalo skulls outside of a fertilizing plant. And I think this one was in Saskatchewan. So this just it helps you understand how rapidly buffalo were depleted and how many. And of course, you can see two individuals here standing on these buffalo skulls, sort of dominating. They had subdued the buffalo. So eventually animal populations started climbing. Extinctions like the passenger pigeon occurred, extirpations, habitat being lost more and more. And John A. Macdonald, who was the first prime minister, actually said the great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system, assimilate Indian people in all respects with the other inhabitants of the Dominion as speedily as they are fit to change. So through the Indian Act, through government, assimilation was a priority. So individuals were renamed with Europeans' name, prohibited from speaking language, stuffed into reserves, declared cultural ceremony illegal, creating residential schools, tearing children away from homes, killing the Indian and the child, which of course, as many people are learning about, there was a lot of abuse. Children weren't allowed to speak their language or practice culture. And in fact, thousands of children died in residential schools. I'm sure you've all seen the news. This is actually from last summer, where people just started finding out about all the unmarked graves at residential schools. Here's 751, and people were so shocked. And we're over 7,000 now, 7,000. And the broader society was shocked, but residential survivors knew this was happening. So it's a very, very painful history of colonization in Canada, but it is a history that's very important to learn. How can we move forward? We need to first understand the wrongs of the past to help right those wrongs and to help make sure that that never happens again. Bob Joseph, who's an Indigenous author, wrote this book about the Indian Act, 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act, which can be hard to get through, but again, important. But he also talks about helping Canadians make reconciliation a reality with Indigenous people. Indigenous people knowledge systems and ways of knowing, although once considered savage and uncivilized, that was wrong. We can coexist. Everyone's worldview, knowledge system, and way of life is equally valid and important. And we all are important actors in reconciliation. We should all be engaging in reconciliation. And so to learn more, I highly recommend this book. It's a great book. book, Bob Joseph says the Indian Act has not achieved its goal of getting rid of the Indian problem. Indigenous culture is openly celebrated by Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. The Indigenous population is the fastest growing segment in Canada. Languages are being revived and recorded, and there are increasing instances of local governments recognizing original names of towns, sites, streets. Indigenous communities and individuals are proudly rebuilding our nations. So, you know, there has been a very horrendous history, but things are changing. We are on a path for change, and it is incredible to be part of. So Jesse Wente, who's an Anishinaabe broadcaster, he shared a presentation that I was once at. He's such a great speaker. And he said in his presentation, in thinking about inclusion and diversity, think of a forest. Is there one kind of tree? No, that tells us the natural way is diverse. This is the natural way to be diverse, to be inclusive. If you see in the background here, this forest, this diverse forest with different species, imagine walking through this forest if you ever have walked through a forest that looks like this. Imagine the understory, the birds fluttering, the bugs going by, the squirrels playing. You can see the diversity in the forest. This forest nourishes life. Now, if you've ever seen a forest plantation, say maybe a red pine forest with trees growing tall, and if you've ever walked under that, you might have noticed that there's really no understory. It's a very quiet and dark forest. You need that diversity to make that life flourish. So if anyone's thinking about, you know, moving ahead in work that you do or in your life and braiding Indigenous and Western ways of knowing, I just want to emphasize it's really, really important to think about doing this in a good way. In the past, people have sought to do this and have done it in a wrong way. Approaching communities, people taking knowledge, not giving back, not prioritizing those values of respect, reciprocity, and responsibility. So there's a lot of things to consider when thinking about doing things in a good way. And when I talk about this, I like to use the braid of sweetgrass as a metaphor. Now, Robin Wall Kimmerer also uses a braid of sweetgrass in her book as a different metaphor. I like to think of it as, again, a braid of sweetgrass is a very important medicine to Anishinaabe people. Now think of a braid with two strands, weaving together Indigenous and Western ways of knowing. If you were to let go of that braid, it would just unravel. You need that third strand, doing things in a good way to make that braid strong. So I will finish off with sharing a quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer, and this is from her book, Traditional Ecological Knowledge, where she writes a chapter in there as well. So thinking back to the title of this presentation, Resource or Relation. So Robin Wall Kimmerer says, through the lens of traditional Indigenous philosophy, the living world is understood not as a collection of exploitable resources, but as a set of relationships and responsibilities. Our responsibility is not only to restore the land, but also to heal our relationship with the land, restoring the covenant of respect, responsibility, and reciprocity. So with that, I will end, and I will say, Chimigwech, thank you so much, everyone, for having me. It's been such a pleasure to be here.